Hey, what's up, guys? Before the podcast begins, I would like to apologize for the lack of videos. I was actually going to show these matches, but the replays are gone for, I guess there was either maintenance or it was too many days, but I just moved back to San Diego. I'm now setting up my apartment, not entirely fixed yet. I need to get better lighting and a few other things, but it's going pretty well for me. Sorry for the lack of videos. I hope you joined the podcast, and once again, I apologize for not being able to show off my CCGS matches. But as you can see, I did make it to the next stage. I will now be in the top 10 in NA, and I'll be playing every Thursday on the Clash Royale official Twitch channel. So catch me there if you want to, and I hope you guys enjoy the podcast. Today we have Esopa and Woody on. What's up, guys?
Howdy, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, no problem. And we're going to talk a lot of in-depth stuff as well as a normal question. So Naders can go ahead and get us started off on that.
Yeah, we're going to later in the episode jump into some Q&A from Twitter. Again, follow us on Twitter. We're going to ask you guys for those questions every couple weeks or so. But first, the biggest news of the last couple weeks is the release of the Mega Knight and the effect that that's had on the meta. So as always, let's talk about the meta. Guys, what's the Mega Knight doing out there?
Whoever wants to take it.
Anybody want to start? Because I'm confused, so I need you guys to help me out with that one.
I don't know. Mega Knight in general, I think, is really strong. Obviously, it's not as broken as people within the current meta. I don't think it's as OP as originally thought. I think it has decent amount of counters. Obviously, P.E.K.K.A's the hard counter, but people have found out how to counter it with Tombstone, Goblin Gang. For example, the swarm units that you can split and you just use it to jump against itself, and then Ice Spirit also works really well against it because it freezes it since it's not immune like the Bandit. I actually think that'd be really a really good way to nerf the Bandit, is just to not make it immune during the dash like the Mega Knight. And yeah, I think it's maybe, I mean, it could take like a small nerf, but I think within the current meta it's somewhat healthy from my how I've been impacted by it. So.
Yeah, I agree with Colton. I think that when we were testing it and looking at it initially in the first like hours and days after it came out, it really looked like a card that could have been properly costed at like 8. And eventually we kind of came to realize that there are a lot of kind of unconventional counters to it. Like Colton mentioned earlier, Tombstone can totally block it. I saw a great video actually by Ash showing exactly how you pull that off. But there just seems to be a propensity, the longer we have access to a card, to find more counters to it than combos with it. And so our initial assumptions about its value tend to go down over time, except for things like Night Witch and I guess Electro Wizard, which on release were just insane, and they were so cheap that they comboed with a ton of different cards. I think that Mega Knight isn't really in the same role because it costs so much. It only hits ground targets. And a card that counters it pretty well was already popular in the metagame, namely the P.E.K.K.A, which costs the exact same and just chops him up, no problem.
Yeah, I don't know, but like the Mega Knight to me has seemed sort of like I'm not gonna say it's like the Night Witch in that it was just overpowered on release, but the way I felt about it was I couldn't ever put down like cheap units like guards or whatever, and then it would just kind of like solve itself like with all the other cards, like with P.E.K.K.A.
Sure.
Yeah, like these big cards, right? And I feel like they've been coming out with these cards that feel so hard to deal with without perfect counters for a while now, like with the Night Witch. I actually do think that the Mega Knight in general is in a good spot, though, especially in this meta where you can use Tombstone, where you can use Inferno Tower, where you can use P.E.K.K.A. I like it. I in general, I like the card. At 7 Elixir, it feels fine. I think it needs a little bit something else to be taken off the top of it. Because if it was just a little bit overwhelming, especially if you don't have the perfect way to counter it.
I think maybe a lot of it has to do with it just being a new card with a new sort of mechanic that people need to adjust to what it's going to do. Because so much of it is not, you're not going to have the perfect counter every time. So you need to be able to know, okay, with the cards that I have, what's the best way that I can counter it? And that's hard when it's a new card that's doing something weird like jumping around, smashing things, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely a card that requires an answer. I kind of like it. It's more of an offensive version of P.E.K.K.A. because P.E.K.K.A. can easily be countered, but it's harder to counter on defense. Just because it hits harder, of course, and it's tankier. But I don't know. I found it interesting. They could give it a small nerf because, for example, if P.E.K.K.A. was taken out of the meta, I think it would be dominant. Just the fact that P.E.K.K.A. was already probably like the most used tank killer made it less impactful, but I like the card. I like how it works. I like Bandit when she came out too, so I like those kind of mechanics, the things they hadn't had previously. I think it's good for them to make the game slightly more advanced. I think they could keep some of the older cards relevant. Maybe bring more older cards back. They did that a little bit with like buffing Dark Prince and Ice Wizard, but those cards still are just kind of not in the meta. Outside of like a few fringe decks, but I would say I'm overall pretty pleased with it. It's not like Night Witch. I mean, it's like Night Witch for competitive, and the fact that they brought it out at the same time during a big tournament, which is kind of not something I like. But it's not overpowered like Night Witch was. Like it took like 3 nerfs to put Night Witch in in a good position or whatever. And Mega Knight, I feel maybe if it gets a slight nerf, maybe the spawn damage has something done with it. I don't know. It's kind of odd for me that he knocks stuff back when he jumps. I don't think it would kill him if they took the knockback away. I don't even know if that's like really a nerf. Other than hog interaction, I don't really find it all that useful, honestly.
You could argue the knockback could be a negative because he has to hit things afterwards a lot of the time. So sometimes it like
splits them up,
knocks them out of the way and splits them up.
It's kind of odd.
Yeah.
But in some scenarios it would be better. Some scenarios it would be worse. I found it interesting though that like when he's not in his spawn, but when he jumps a thing, he knocks him back too. But I don't know if that would be worse or better. But I think if they nerf him somehow, I don't think you touch his like damage or his health. I think you touch maybe his because he doesn't have to be. He doesn't do exactly like Fireball. So I mean, you can kind of do whatever you want with this spawn damage. It's not linked to another card like Goblins are with Goblin Gang. So you can kind of nerf him however you want. So I think if they find in the future that he's too OP or that people found how to use him too well, yeah.
I feel like in general they're overloading a lot of these cards as kits for I don't really know what reason. Like with I'm gonna say like the cannon cart. I'm just gonna use an example. It dies and then it becomes like a cannon. The Mega Knight it has like spawn damage, then it also has knockback. There's the Night Witch which dies and then creates bats and while creating bats while she's alive. You know, like there's Ewiz with this zap, and then you have like the more simpler cards like with the Goblin Gang. It just comes out, and then that's it. You have goblins, super simple. And I'm sort of wary about the direction that's kind of taking, because if this keeps going on, they're going to keep thinking, oh, I got to create cards that are really interesting, and then these interesting cards will have kits that are front loaded, and you're gonna have to do a lot more to like balance that in terms of game mechanics. And I don't know if you need to add something to a card every single time to make it more interesting. Like the Mega Knight, if you think about it, without the knockback mechanic too, would be good. It would be interesting. Like it doesn't need it. That's just what I'm trying to say.
I think new mechanics are good.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
I could step in and say something real quick about that, because I know that they've said in the past that they want the higher rarity tier cards to have more mechanics and have more in their kit and be weirder and have more special effects. And so the cards that you just mentioned, like Bandit, Cannon Cart, Mega Knight, Night Witch, are cards that are epics, legendaries, and that I think players kind of expect to do weird and different things. It would kind of be boring if a Goblin Gang were souped up and like were an epic or a legendary, if it was just like 3 little dudes running around. So it makes sense to me that those are commons. I think that the issue that we're seeing, and something that you're right about, and that does seem to be a little bit worrying in the immediate future, is that they want to balance out the number of cards per rarity. And just right now, there just aren't very many legendary cards compared to the number of commons, rares, epics in the game. We didn't even have legendaries when the game dropped. So as more cards get released, and if they tend to prefer having more legendaries being released, then we will see lots of funky mechanics like this coming around. Something I'd like to touch on, though, if anyone wants to bounce off of this, is the fact that Flying Machine's going to be coming out pretty soon. And although it's not going to be a hard counter to the Mega Knight, it will be a pretty good component in a deck that will be trying to shut it down.
Yeah, so I mean, I think they timed things like that well. I'm sure they knew P.E.K.K.A was very meta at the time, so if anything, that tuned him down. A lot of people in the Mega Knight Challenge use P.E.K.K.A and Mega Knight. Flying Machine will be interesting. It looks like, I mean, like people showed videos of it in the past, and it's similar to like a flying Dart Goblin or something. So it'll be interesting how it functions, because the DPS seems decent, but it's kind of like Dart Goblin where it stacks up the longer it's just able to sit there, and due to its range, it probably will be able to sit there for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see how that card interacts. But just the last bit talking about how cards work with their rarity and stuff, I think that's okay. If you look at other like big games, like League of Legends, Esopa I know plays that. The later games get into like production of new champions. If you're talking about League, they do seem like all the new champions now in League come out with, instead of the 4 base abilities, they come out with like 5 different passives on different abilities, and they're a lot more complex. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing as long as they do a good job of balancing. I think it's cool to add new mechanics and to keep the game like I don't know. I like making the game more difficult and raising the ceiling on skill as opposed to just really binary cards. So as long as they do a good job of balancing, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing is when you, especially with the legendaries, where like you said, they're kitted out with 5 or 6 different abilities. The tricky thing is if you release something that's really, really versatile, it kind of can be overwhelming because it'll fit into every deck, right? If it does 3 or 4 or 5 different things really, really well. You're seeing a little bit less of that now, but that's how E-Wiz was for a long time. That's how Night Witch was for a long time. I think that's the trap that they got to be careful. And on the converse side, on the other side of that, there's cards where you release it and it does a couple cool things, but it doesn't quite do anything good enough. Yeah. I'm thinking of like Cannon Cart, right? And then you don't see it in any decks because it doesn't do any one thing very well, and it doesn't do all the things at all very well, you know?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a quick bounce off of that regarding rarity and like ease of play. I think that legendary card should be high risk, high reward. And I think a good example of kind of an inversion of that principle is the Log being legendary and Zap being common. I think that Zap is one of the highest skill cap cards in the game. And when you use it properly, you can just absolutely wreck someone, get another hit off with a really high damage troop like a P.E.K.K.A, mini P.E.K.K.A, instantly kill anything that's on your opponent's side of the arena, stun, force resetting, big targeting troops, reset Inferno Tower, There's so many mechanics with Zap, and the fact that it's a common that just is immediately available is really funny compared to the Log, which just does damage and a small bit of knockback in like a vertical area.
I just want to address that, like, one of the biggest misconceptions about like card rarity and balancing is that it has nothing to do with each other. When people use the argument that it's a legendary, so therefore it deserves more kit, more strength, more balancing, more nerfs, whatever, it's a completely different thing, because card rarity only applies to monetary value. That's all it is. You have commons, rares, epics, legendaries, and throughout the tiers you get more money. They create more money for it, but it has nothing to do with balance. So when you're balancing a card, like, they shouldn't ever balance a card due to its rarity. That's all I'm trying to say there.
Yeah.
If the power of the card.
Yeah. If I mean, like, you could take the example of the RG and the Elite Barbarians Reddit buff or whatever. The problem with the card was it was its rarity, but it wasn't. But the problem was its rarity, but it didn't, like, they didn't balance it according to that. Do you guys know what I mean?
Yeah.
because
Sadly, yeah.
yeah, like eventually what they did was, I think they just turned the RG tick time, its deploy time,
Deploy time. Yeah,
up.
it's longer.
Yeah, it kind of like just didn't make sense. I I don't know. I don't like how they approach that at all. I feel like
We've talked about this a little bit before, and it's they're treating the symptom and not the disease, right? The real problem is that people can overlevel commons on ladder, and for certain commons like RG and E-barbs, that can make a really big deal if you've got 2 levels higher than everybody else that you're facing, or you're running up against people 2 levels higher with commons. But instead of addressing that problem, which is a game economy problem and a ladder problem, they just nerfed the bejesus out of those cards, especially E-barbs. Not, RG is still okay on ladder. But yeah, they're treating the symptom and not the actual problem. And I think if they're going forward, they're trying not to step into that problem anymore by not releasing any more commons that are really susceptible to that kind of thing. But in the meantime, you've got 2 cards in your game that are in this limbo where they can't be played outside of being over leveled on ladder. They're never going to be seen in tournament play.
Yeah, and they recently said that was like a big mistake of theirs, that they regret having commons that are like win conditions, or ones that are so punishing, or more so punish cards than win conditions. But so they won't do that again. But as far as, I agree with the Esopa, just because a card is a legendary, and they have a few legendaries, most of them are viable, but a few that are just bad or not as viable. So I think it's okay to have cards have cool mechanics, but that doesn't necessarily have to make them versatile or like must uses in all decks. So I'm okay with legendaries not being viable. I just think legendaries should have cool mechanics because they're legendary. But in the case of like Sparky, Ice Wiz, what other ones? I mean, Cannon Cart's an epic, but those cards that come to mind, they have cool effects, but they're not necessarily overwhelming. So yeah, as long as they don't make sure that every legendary that comes out is like a must-have in every deck, I think it's cool to have new mechanics, but not necessarily overloading their kits.
Yeah, they can be exciting without being overpowered.
Yeah, like I mean, Knight is used in
super versatile.
like Knight, for example, is used in a bunch of decks. It's really simple, but it's really solid for very specific reasons. I'm okay with it being like more viable than Ice Wiz. Ice Wiz just being a legendary, and that's the example I'm using. But as long as they can make cool cards without them being like overpowered or must-haves in every deck. So yeah, I agree.
I mean, just like think of it like if you reverse zap and log, what is the actual change? There's absolutely no change. The only thing there is that Supercell says that one card is a legendary, one card is a common.
Yeah, it just affects ladder
the only thing
for players that don't have max cards.
So if they ever balance on top for that, or you see someone ever make that argument, then it should be thrown out the window.
Yeah,
on the spot.
I did see in the. I didn't watch the full update videos, but I know they like mentioned skins, so that's kind of cool. We talked about that in past episodes.
Yeah, they mentioned skins. They mentioned one thing that I was a little, I don't know, it was disappointing to me a little bit, is they said that diversity, when there's diversity of meta decks and cards and whatever, it tends to lead to rock, paper, scissors. And I kind of push back on that a little bit, because I think you can have diversity without necessarily leading to a situation where there's really extreme 80-20 matchups. We've talked about this before, but I don't think it's necessarily an outcome of diversity. Diversity is something that everybody should want. I mean, if you want an exciting game.
I mean, in the past meta, it wasn't that there was so many things viable. It's that the cards that were viable were bad for any meta. So I mean, heal just kind of killed the meta, because it created like a trio of spells to where they all countered each other. Heal counters poison, fireball. Well, it was actually interesting. It wasn't just heal; it was also Night Witch, because poison decks innately countered Night Witch, and then heal decks innately countered poison, and then fireball decks countered Three Musk Heal. So it was just like and we talked about this before. It's like a triangle of things countering each other. So they did a good job of alleviating that. I'm surprised they did. Yeah, I'm surprised they would make that statement after they just fixed the previous like issue. Like it was the cards that were viable, not necessarily the decks that were viable. And maybe they just. I mean, there is like there are going to be some matchups that are tough, but I think the meta always gravitates towards decks that have good matchups against everything. Like once metas are settled, it's almost always the control decks that come out on top because no one likes playing decks that are like 90-10 matchups and then like 10-90 matchups. That's why people don't play Siege a ton, because Siege like just destroys some decks and it gets destroyed by others. So it's usually control decks that kind of come out on top. That's why there's a lot of like P.E.K.K.A control, Mega Knight control right now, which I think you should try to make stuff like Beatdown and Siege viable, but they did give it a small buff with like Siege, and it's still around, and it can still be a surprise deck, but I think it balances in a decent place right now as far as like deck compositions go.
So Woody's known for playing Siege from the very beginning and being an excellent player and strategist. Have you thought about that? Because I think he's right. Siege tends to lend itself to more extreme matchups in that rock paper scissors sense.
Yeah, you're very kind with my performance. It's been
just tell him the truth, my friend. Just tell him the truth.
Yeah, I'd say Siege typically does better immediately after balance updates, where people don't really know what they're supposed to be playing, and Siege can kind of punish people who are confused or are unprepared, as opposed to like what Colton said, where control gets better, the deeper and more settled the meta gets, because people like playing decks where they can win 55% of the time if they're the more skilled player, and Siege can kind of make you feel like you're just kind of flipping a coin before the match begins, and if you know how to play it well, you win if you're up against a bad deck, or you lose if you're up against a good deck.
Yeah.
Or best case, you're playing 3 minutes just to draw.
I will say on ladder, like Mortar is super nice because in bad matchups it can draw. Same with Expo actually. If you're playing max ladder, it's more so. I usually am talking about tournament standard where it's not quite as good, but Siege is nice as well. Where Siege is interesting because I think Siege has a higher skill cap. Like the top Siege players can make it work in almost any meta, and they'll be able to like Turtwig plays it relentlessly, like at all times, and he always does really well on top ladder. And then I think Beatdown's kind of the opposite, to where Beatdown does take skill and like elixir management, but there's a lot less decisions being made throughout the game with a Beatdown deck like Golem. That's why Golem is really popular among like tournament standard for lower level players, is because it's pretty simple. You play a tank and you play stuff behind it. While Expo is more a little bit more elixir, a little bit more micro moves, and really Beatdown is just elixir management. So
Here's, I got a card idea for you. You were talking about rock paper scissors earlier, and we saw a nerf to heal. But let me know what you think about this. This is kind of coming out of the blue, so if you don't like it, just shoot it down. But I want to introduce a card called Dark Mirror, where before the game begins, you select Dark Mirror, and as part of the Dark Mirror, you can choose between one of two cards. So I pick Dark Mirror, right? I have like a level 4 Dark Mirror, and then I pick like Rocket and Log in my Dark Mirror. And then when I start the game, the Dark Mirror is like a card in your slot. Then if I slide it up and to the left, it becomes the Rocket. And then if I slide it up and to the right, it becomes the Log. And then for the entirety of the game, I can only use one or the other. And that card costs 1 more than it usually does. So the Log would be 3, Rocket would be 7. And it would take the level of the Dark Mirror.
I think that's interesting.
It's complicated, but I like it.
Yeah.
It allows for more counterplay and so something that I've said recently is that having some very limited RNG elements in the game that would allow for more skilled and more counterplay would be kind of cool. I think that sort of slots into that because you could adjust based on your matchup and what you were playing,
So how I guess it would be weird. So it makes the cards like what, slightly under leveled? How would that work at tournament standard, I guess?
So at tournament standard, the cards would operate the exact same. They would just cost 1 more, the same way Mirror
they would
currently
cost
works.
1 more,
Yeah.
okay.
At level
throughout the whole game, Log would be 3 and Rocket would be 7.
So does your opponent know that you
Yeah, there could be some visual effect where it indicates that it's a dark mirror card.
I guess if it's a dark mirror, you could have like the dark elixir above the card or whatever shoes instead of. I don't know how that would work. I don't know. I would think there would need to be some visual indicator, but that would be interesting. The only like weird thing about that is I think people would use it more often with tanks than they would spells, because I guess kind of one elixir is a bigger deal like the smaller card it is. So I can kind of imagine people just like, I don't know. So maybe one of the cards you have is P.E.K.K.A, and if they obviously have beatdown, you pick P.E.K.K.A. If they have control, you just pick like whatever your other card is, because the P.E.K.K.A is not useful in that matchup. So that would be interesting though. That would be really hard to balance, but I do like the idea.
I like the idea, but there's some tricky things with it. Like, what if you get offered 2 cards that are just garbage?
Oh, did you say you get to pick them? Yeah.
Yeah, you pick the cards beforehand.
Oh, you select the 2 beforehand.
For your deck, yeah. You like say, okay, I need an answer to log bait. I put a log in the dark mirror, but then if they wind up playing Three Muskets or some super heavy beat deck, yeah, then I have Rocket in there also.
True.
And it sticks for the whole game too. You can't like go back and forth between the two. It's like once you pick one, like you're like locked into it for that game.
I would also
actually like it.
I think that's kind of cool.
It promotes change. I like that.
Yeah, at the very least, we need cards, that are thinking along those lines that allow more potential for counterplay. I think that helps resolve the rock paper scissors question while keeping a diverse meta in place.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's like if everyone has the ability to counter each other, then there's less like rock paper scissors if every deck like counters the other. That's interesting. I kind of like the idea though. The other thing that we've kind of talked about a little bit, and I would still like to be implemented, is just a little bit of control over starting hands. I don't know, being able to switch out one card at random from your starting hand would be nice. One thing, and Full Frontage was like, this is why I think Pump is broken. I played in CCGS. And I talked about it a little bit in a video I released, but I played a mirror match, and it was a Pump deck. And game 1, I had the Pump 7th card, and he had it 1st card, and he ended up it's a mirror match with like a pressure deck. It's very similar to like the 3 Musk mirror match, and it was Mega Knight P.E.K.K.A, like kind of like Cycle. It's a pressure deck. It's like bridge spam essentially. But anyway, he had the Pump the first game, and he ended up beating me like with like 30 seconds left in overtime, and then it was reversed. The exact same matchup. I had the Pump in my starting hand. He had an 8th card, and I won before the game hit overtime. So it's like I would say that, I mean, I think it was obvious. Like, I played the deck better than him, but just having the card rotation in his favor enabled him to win a matchup that in the mirror match, when I had the advantage, I won like 2 minutes earlier, and it wasn't even close. Like, I didn't take any damage on my towers. So that is kind of unfortunate that legit, no matter how skillful you are, that's a really clear case to where starting hand directly impacted the way the game went. So it would be really cool in my opinion. That wouldn't necessarily fix it, but it would kind of alleviate it if there's just like a small element. I don't think you should be able to start your exact starting hand, like pick all 4. Like, I think that would make the game boring, but I think some element of control could help it. But yeah, I would like to see them do something about that, or I don't know, fix cards that are kind of impact starting hand a little bit too much, like Pump. At least it's not. I think it was kind of really bad when it was like the best card in the game, because it would impact games even heavier. But in decks that it's still used, I think cards like that can be an issue. Yeah.
So something like a limited mulligan, like you get to select one card and throw everything else back, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, like I think just being able to or vice versa. Just being able to swap out like one card at the beginning of the game would be nice. And I think this also helps fix the issue of people not playing cards at the beginning of the game. I'm wanting to say Riot, but that's stupid. A Supercell employee I talked to at GamerG actually was asking about that, because there was one game where I was playing Golem, and I was like, if he's not playing, I'm not playing crap. I'm waiting until double elixir. This helps me. So of course I ended up winning, but I just waited until Jigsaw and I both waited. He had Giant, so he's playing a version of Beatdown, but I was playing Golem, so it favored me because I had the bigger Beatdown. And he's like, that's kind of boring for the spectators and and we're trying to think of ways to fix it. And he just asked, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. For me, I'm worried about winning, so I could care less. But I think that helps if it could be one time per game you can swap out a card at the beginning of the hand, or it could be like every 10 seconds only at the beginning of the game, every 10 seconds where you go past like leaking elixir, like one card is swapped out for you. I think if one card is swapped out, it gives you a higher chance of having something to play. Because a lot of the time people don't play not because it favors their deck, but because they have like a crappy hand, like they have, I don't know, like a miner or just any like tank, like a tank, and then like their spells and I don't know, a big troop like executioner, I don't know. So nothing that you like want to start. I think if people do decide, if both players decide to wait, then enabling them to both switch out one card or doing it for them could like prevent that from happening in more games. But yeah, that was just my idea.
Yeah, I don't think that
could work for multiple reasons, I guess, but I think it would help.
As long as whatever they do is consistent across like every game, because that change, if they ever do put it in, is gonna be game breaking, or game changing, just because like it hasn't happened in this quite yet. The only RNG that I'm actually okay with, because this game is a card game, is the hand that you're dealt. And in almost every card game I've ever played, it's always the hand that you're dealt, right? Or like the cards that you get. And if they actually change that, then the game as we know it becomes different. I think just fundamentally, and for them to do that, they have to get it right. If you do that wrong, there's gonna be some pretty big repercussions coming, and you don't need that. I don't know. I favor it just because you take away these like random elements, and just also from a spectator standpoint, just sitting there and watching two people just leak 10 elixir for all day just because playing a card is so bad in that scenario is just not fun to watch.
Which
the only big non-card based change that they've made to the game is elixir overcharge and removing it. Yeah. And so if they were huge. It was absolutely huge. It was something
nerf
that only competitive players understood. Yeah, and nerf beatdown, but it also made it so that you were less likely to play the first card, because if you played the first card and you timed your elixir overcharge correctly, you basically got one free elixir because your opponent didn't get.
So it made it or they could bring that's something I had forgotten about, or you could just bring back elixir overcharge and it fixes that problem.
That was like more than a year ago, maybe. I still miss the 11th elixir.
Yeah, I do too.
It just
because you could time
I like
it.
mulligans though. I like that.
You could, I like both. I mean, the cool thing about 11th elixir is it doesn't really affect casual games. I think anything that like makes the game more advanced while not affecting casual games is really nice, because it gives like a caster to like write home about, like whether a player did something correctly or something they took advantage of. I think that's cool. And it also, and the 11th elixir as well, would also keep people from waiting all the time just because their hand is bad. So I just think anything to like to take out the boring elements of the game and to give players more control is like a good thing. So all of those suggestions sound really nice in my opinion as a pro player or whatever.
I actually agreed with them taking out the 11th elixir. Just like, I like the fact that you would only know about it, or you could only really abuse it if you did your research into it. Like, oh yeah, this is the 11th elixir, I watched Orange Juice, I did this. Like, no casual player, like truly casual, would ever know about it. But having something like that in the game, outside of like card interactions or cards themselves, which you, the player, should be able to figure out, I don't think having an in-game feature like that, not publicly known or even just like tipped, should exist. So taking it out was, I think, the correct
thing. I think the other thing and I'm just rethinking about this now because I haven't thought about the 11th elixir in forever. I think what they could have done is they could have made a visual for it on the elixir bar, to where it's maybe the elixir icon starts filling up with like a different color, and then it just resets when you run out. So I think maybe maybe they could actually embrace it as opposed to just trashing it. So that could be a thought, but maybe it's too far gone for that to happen.
I think it just didn't fit with their conception of it. Like they said, it was a bug or something. It wasn't intended from the beginning, right? It was supposed to cap out at 10. The problem was they weren't capping it out at 10. They were just adding an elixir every how many seconds. So when they finally got around to fixing it, I think that just matched their conception from the beginning that you stop at 10 and you don't generate beyond that.
Yeah, which makes sense. And I mean the only other thing that like I truly have an issue with it still is graveyard. Like as much as I love I like using the card, and we talked about it before when Esopa was on. Still, they just they did the same thing kind of with RG. They just threw a band-aid on it instead of actually changing the inherent issue with the card, which I think is the RNG, because it just results in completely different outcomes, which I don't think is something you should strive for in a competitive game. I think it should be consistent. I mean, like one placement sometimes activates the King Tower, sometimes it doesn't. One placement does 500 more damage this time, does no damage the next time. I just because it's just really inconsistent, and now the card's not in the meta, so you don't see it as much, so it's not as big a problem. But that's a band-aid, because what if the card does come back into meta, or you just kill the card that is pretty interesting because it has this other issue, and maybe they don't see it as an issue, but I think competitive players have consistently pointed it out as an issue. So I wish they would standardize that card or fix it some way. You can buff it, just make it standardized.
It's setting a bad precedent though between RG, E-Barbs, where if you've got a somewhat complicated problem with the card, instead of trying to find a fix that will allow it to stay in the game, you just kind of kill it, you know? Not that I think Graveyard's dead, but it's just not nearly as good.
And I mean, it's fine because it was in the meta for a long time. I'm not saying that it has to be in the meta. I'm just saying I would have preferred they nerfed it in a different way. Like, crap, you didn't even have to give it a buff. Like, just make it standardized, and the card would be worse, because then people would find consistent ways to counter it. But then at least it would be consistent. So I think that would have been cool. And I say this every podcast because I want it to happen. But so if they ever watch it,
I don't necessarily have a problem. I don't necessarily have a problem with limited RNG on one card. Well, my problem is that it's one card with a little bit of RNG. If there was a couple cards or a few cards with some random element, fine. But you can't have one, because it's the outlier, you know? It's the one thing that's different from every other card in the game. You either have a game where there's a card, your card draw at the very beginning is the only RNG element, or you have a game that has a few RNG elements. You can't have this middle ground where there's just one card that does drastically different things depending on what you do with it, or how it plays out.
It was a dominant outlier for like 8 months.
Yeah.
So, there's not much to say. I mean, if you look back now, the whole deck diversity argument and rock paper scissors goes back even like further than heal, Night Witch and all that. I really do think that it started with Graveyard for a long time, and then it just got worse because they kept on releasing cards without fixing the problems. So the problems kept building and building, and then we got to a point where we were playing in the most atrocious meta I've ever seen for the longest time, and it took stomping out Heal, stomping out Night Witch, stomping out Graveyard, in order for us to see Battle Ram, like for us to finally see what like a real like a somewhat healthy meta looks like, right? And it's just kind of nuts to me how long that took, and how much you can just how much they could just like ignore it for. I don't know.
I always say this, but for as much as we bitch and moan, we got to give them credit when they do come through with something like helping fix one of the worst rock paper scissors situations.
I've said continuously, like, give credit to the community. It was not their changes; it was the community who fixed the game. If you left it up to them, if we said nothing, the game will keep going on and on and on. Maybe in the scenario, like 1 out of 100 times, they would actually understand and play the game and get it right. But why would you leave it up to that?
Yeah.
because like from their track record, there's no way anyone would ever bet on them getting it right. The community, they followed the changes, they did it, they actually listened, and the result is that the game was fixed. You give them credit for listening for the first time, but you don't give them credit for the changes or for the game as it is right now. You give it to the people who play the game, who are passionate, and who understood what were the real problems.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in a plug for that video that you did, commenting on their balancing talk. That was one of the best Clash Royale videos I've ever seen. It was fantastic. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the community that's the one that's speaking out on these things. On the other hand, you've got large communities that rail against what they see as problems in the game that, at least at higher levels, we don't necessarily see as problems, like the eBarb and RG scenario. You know.
Yeah, I think the video gave voice to a lot of people in the community who felt like they weren't being listened to. I think I said before that I thought I was a little overly critical and deviated a little bit from.
He was mad for sure.
Discussion.
I felt you there. You know.
Yeah, it was well said for the most part.
Yeah, and I think that's good. Because I mean, you have to draw a line with the like casual players that you listen to, like they moan about certain cards, and of course we say that we think we know best because we're the competitive players, but we're vastly outnumbered by them, and it just depends on where the ears are. If you hear enough complaints, you start to get desensitized to it. So I can kind of not entirely fault game developers on that. Being in their position must be somewhat difficult because most of the time you're either not hearing from people or you're hearing negative things, so it kind of makes you not want to listen at all. But I'm glad they have been getting things right, whether that is what they should do or not. I mean, and it is what they should do because it helps their revenue if they fix the game correctly. But yeah, I think lately they've done a better job. I just hope that they continue to work to make the game fair. I think they just need to continue to make the game as fair as possible because, I mean, people are always going to have excuses, but I mean, that's the biggest complaint about this game is over leveling and that people just like the game to be fair, and people will always complain, but as long as you strive for getting as close to like equality as possible, or balance as possible, I think you're doing good. And I think recently with the changes they made a big stride in that direction entirely, where a bunch of people were just really off put by the game they had to play for a couple months when it comes to like tournament standard.
I want to say in their recent AMA the other day that they also answered a question to the effect of, yeah, we're trying to listen more to the people who think about this game at a very deep level and talk about it on Twitter and Reddit and elsewhere, you know, pros and et cetera. Did I make that up? I think I remember that.
I don't think so.
Their statements have always been, if you take it for face value, have always been really good. In that AMA too, like I saw it, they said, yeah, we're taking in pro feedback and whatever, but who exactly are the pros that you're talking to? Who exactly are you getting your information from?
Yeah.
You know, like, you just have to go one layer deeper and you'll naturally be skeptical.
Which is why they won't let you go a layer deeper.
Yeah, and you know, you have to be aware of that. You can't just sit back and say, "Oh yeah, this is gonna be good," because at the end of the day, they're the developers. They're the ones who balance and create the game that you're playing. And if you want to see the game being fair, then you have to give your feedback as well. You have to be participatory. You can't just like be a Reddit warrior and complain about.
It's interesting that they say they listen to Reddit so much because I don't know. In others, I mean, I enjoy the Reddit for a lot of things, but it's just interesting to read it for like balance recommendations. And I think there's some specific people, but a lot of times when I go into the Reddit, it's just the majority opinion is nowhere near similar to our opinion, because I mean, it's weird because casual players, for the most part, when they complain about something, it's about ladder. And it's just so weird that it's not like any other game where the competitive players play an entirely different game, honestly, from the casual player, because we're either playing max ladder or we're playing tournament standards, which those two alone have pretty big differences, but they're both at a somewhat equal playing field, and it's just you're not playing the same game in a lot of ways. So pro players will scoff at people complaining about certain cards, but it's because that is like a legitimate issue for them. So it's tough to hear all these different sources, because I mean Reddit I don't always agree with on some of the posts they like to upvote, but it's a different community from ours, so you kind of have to understand it from both players' perspective and Supercell's perspective when they're balancing and when they're making changes. And of course I think they should balance entirely around tournament standard, but at the end of the day they're a business and you have to kind of go the way that the majority wants you to go. So
yeah, we can't forget that it's a profit motive. Ultimately they're trying to appeal to the most amount of people, not necessarily the highest. At the same time, I absolutely agree with what I think Esopa said in that video, is you have to balance around the level playing field of competitive play,
And that's been their official justification for every balance change they've ever made, except for Royal Giant Elite Barbarians, where they
very good.
Straight up conceded that, yeah, it was balanced at tournament rules, but it was bad on ladder, so we had to nerf it.
It was bad to deal with. I would still be very happy if they could somehow start making it. What I think would be really nice if they don't necessarily have to take away levels, but if they could just make it to where everyone can max out their troops, like much easier than it is right now, and they somehow start monetizing in a different way through like skins, I would really be happy with that, because then it would be more of a level playing field, and I don't know if that'll ever happen, but that's like the dream, is if they could get every player on a level playing field. Because I mean, if you go into a YouTube comment section, every player thinks they're the best in the world, and the levels are just holding them back. So I would really like to see how much of that is actually true, and like give every player the same opportunity. Yeah, very little. I mean, crap. Almost everyone has tournament standard cards, and how many people got 20 wins? It was like 10,000 out of what, 24 million or something, like insanely low.
Yeah, it was predicted at like what 0.01% of player base or something.
Yeah,
which makes you happy as a pro community, because practically every pro was able to achieve it. Which is really cool, noticing that you're actually really good at a video game compared to other people. But so I just think more opportunities like the 20-win challenge would be really nice, and make monetizing in a different way would make that possible.
Yeah, but then like the game would become like a real esport game, and we can't really expect that.
I know, I can dream though.
Yeah, you can dream. The whole system of mobile gaming, especially with like how they monetize it, and this game especially, and they do it so well, which is why they make so much money.
Yeah.
But the ladder will never be 1v1 player fair base. Even at max ladder, it's unfair. I mean, like what? Me, Woody, I don't know about you, Naders. If you're 13, I know Colin is 13, but if you meet someone with a level 5 Mega Knight now, does that seem fair?
Yeah, no. People that can drop $2,000 on a brand new card have an advantage, especially if that card's good. It would have been like legitimately easy in the Night Witch meta if you could just get to level 5, because it's like not even a good player has to use that well.
Yeah, or when Mega Knight's brand new and nobody knows how to counter it perfectly, and all of a sudden you're facing a level 5 on ladder. Yeah, good luck.
Timing is essential, whether it's at the end of the season or at the beginning.
It'll never. I mean, and if you ever hear someone just complaining about ladder, that's the whole point of it. You're supposed to complain about it. It's supposed to be unfair.
Makes you want to spend money. Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, you don't balance in unfair mode. It's like trying to balance free for all. Makes no sense. It's like trying to balance deathmatch. Makes no sense. It's just you do it to have fun. And at the end of the day, that's what it is. That's why I use the argument of you must balance at something. So you use tournament standard. tournament standard is the only fair playing ground. Max ladder isn't fair. And I talked to, like, I got into a Skype call directly with, like, a person who owns, like, 20, 30 maxed accounts and just gives them out, right, to the top players. And the first thing he told me was, max ladder isn't fair. Even at the top, the biggest disadvantage comes from money.
Mm-hmm.
So why are you balancing for this? Even all the way up to the top. Makes no sense to me.
Yeah, which is the unfortunate thing. I'm grateful that it doesn't impact like straight up competitive play because I just have to unlock the card and use it. So that's nice, but I mean every like I don't know 99% of players that play this game it does affect. So rather unfortunate. And yeah, I mean skins are like something that is nice to have, but it probably would never bring them as much money as the rage-induced ladder does, and wanting the gym cards to get them maxed out and stuff. So,
no,
you only have to buy 4 super magical chests to get a level 2 Mega Knight. What are you complaining about?
Yeah, that new offer is just kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Wait, what? I opened it up and it's a full health. I don't know. It's a full price super magical for a ×9.
Yeah, it's just a 50% chance in a super magical to get a Mega Knight in a super magical. And it's so ugly. Like I've watched people open them. Like if you open a super magical, Orange Juice did a video on it. It's like so ugly seeing that chest open to just see how little comes out. It's like I would rather have like a 12 Winchester too, and it's what like 46.
I can't separate. I can't separate in my mind. I always in my mind, if I ever look at that offer, I don't see 4,900 gems. I see $40 or whatever it is. You know,
49 Grand Challenge runs. Yeah.
And I'm just like I can't do. Even if I had a lot of money, which I don't, I can't shell that over for the chance at getting a Mega Knight.
It just hurts your soul a little bit, and then. It's crazy to think about because that's how they unlock new legendaries. They just spam super magical chests. It's pretty crazy because super magical chests, like, I feel like if I'm dropping that much money on a chest, I would want to feel rewarded. But I see people open super magical chests and it's just it's like a Grand Challenge chest is better for the most part, or maybe 2 Grand Challenge chests is better. And then I see. And then if you go back like way far back and look at like 15K chest openings for like even like 10th place, it's like those chests were loaded. They had so many cards and so many like epics and legendaries in them. Like seeing a chest with multiple legendaries is just crazy. The fact that that doesn't exist anymore is sad. But it's nice that in the recent updates they have a lot of like buzz terms that seem really cool. Like they had like clan wars mentioned and quests and all that type of stuff. So they're doing a good job of keeping the game alive at least, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and you know we did get a challenge where we could unlock the Mega Knight. You get 12 wins, you get the Mega Knight.
Exactly.
And there is a way for people who are really rich to get the Mega Knight. So the very skilled and the very rich get it. I just want something in the middle. You know, I want someone who can buy, you know, maybe a legendary chest for 500 gems, or someone who's willing to like go grind tournaments. And you know, maybe won't be top 10 of the tournaments, but will be like number 50. Like I want there to be like 3 tournaments, like all the time. I think everyone should get to play a tournament once a week and have like the 15K rewards that we used to have. And then not be something that they like sell to people, but just something that like every player has a right.
Yeah, because in the
or like or in your like seasonal chest reward, like you get a ticket for a 15K.
Mm-hmm.
Like that'd be so cool. Or like 2 or 3, you know, whatever. Like they'll find a way to balance the economy for it. But I think that the ability to like get 50th place, but still get something really cool.
Yeah, because I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not affecting your player base. If like 50 players benefit per week or whatever, it's not going to hurt you at all. It's just giving the players something to aspire to obtain, even if they don't have a chance. So
the frustrating thing for me, and the reason why I don't really do any of those tournaments is because if I ever finish high, it's likely going to be like 4th or 5th. And then it's just like the cards that you get even in the biggest tournaments for 5th place is like, what did I spend my time doing that for?
Like
you know,
almost a magical chest. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
oh, great.
It's like unless you get top 3 in the current tournaments, you get nothing. And it's funny too. Like if you just hop in one and get like top 100 or whatever, it's like it still takes like a couple hours to get like 10 cards. It's like, why am I waiting for this? So
Yeah.
it's crazy because used to for those big 15K chests, people would wait like days, days to unlock it. It's like, wow, this is reminiscent of Clash of Clans. I have to wait a week to open this thing.
I mean, like, even when they took out 15Ks, I never understood why they couldn't keep card rewards even just like somewhat close to what they would be. It's like, I know it's an economy, and with the way they kind of did all the math, with like all the gems being so high with super magicals and stuff, it kind of threw me for a loop that when Grand Challenges came out, it cost 100 gems for relatively really high prices, really high rewards, but they couldn't do that with tournaments. They couldn't even keep it somewhat close. With the gap between what we have now and what we had before is so large that there's no way that Grand Challenges, something like Grand Challenges or that middle ground, couldn't have been implemented. You know, like I don't know. It was just so weird.
We'd be a much angrier bunch if there weren't Grand Challenges right now. I can tell you that.
Yeah, that
much.
was a really good addition, and they have good
the
ideas.
best addition to the game ever.
Yeah, for sure.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
If you guys got another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you want to do Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Our first question. Let's take one from Morgan Gamers on Twitter. Since we already talked about the Mega Knight, they want to know: do you think the Mega Knight shifts the meta into a counter Mega Knight meta?
A counter Mega Knight?
Like,
I don't think it's so dominant yet. I don't think it's so popular that people are only like trying to tech against Mega Knight. I think that you should have a counter to it, but it's like, no. It's not the one deciding the first thing you're thinking of when you build your deck.
If anything, the Mega Knight entered into a meta that already countered. It just makes P.E.K.K.A. decks a little bit better than they already were.
And Knight plus anything else is pretty good against Mega Knight.
It makes mini tanks
feel like there was
better.
already answers.
Like, there were already answers. Like it just gave a buff to like mini P.E.K.K.A., Knight, Ice Golem, Ice Spirit, and P.E.K.K.A. Like all the like tank killers, like melee units that were already good. It just made them a little bit better. So if anything, it just kind of cemented the meta that already existed, and then kind of inserted itself in like in a way. But basically, it's played in the same decks that P.E.K.K.A.'s played in. It's just maybe a little bit better than. In some ways, but it's not necessarily just like a sub, like, okay, Mega Knight's better against every deck that P.E.K.K.A. plays. It's just not good against P.E.K.K.A. itself. I don't think it's that simple. I think P.E.K.K.A. and Mega Knight function in different ways. I think they're healthy. And I think Mega Knight decks can still beat P.E.K.K.A. decks if they play really smart around the P.E.K.K.A. So.
Yeah. I don't play smart, and I beat a P.E.K.K.A. deck with the Mega Knight the other day. So
you just either have to. It's kind of like how it's kind of similar to Giant decks. You either just don't play it, or you bait it out first. And it's a little bit better in Giant because it doesn't just die. It holds the P.E.K.K.A. there for a while and kind of DPSs it down a little bit. While like I don't know, an Inferno Dragon or something can take it out if played well.
And if Mega Knight's your only big card, I feel like the control decks handle that pretty well as well. Just with Inferno Tower or whatever, Inferno Dragon. You got answers, and it's not going to get any better for the Mega Knight because people are, like we said, going to continue to figure out how to counter it bigger and better and cheaper and whatever.
Yeah,
I
figured out how to counter it with Goblin Game pretty consistently. It's funny if it's by itself.
The Mega Knight definitely is not at a point where it's like a card that has to be answered. It has to be answered, and that if it's played, you answer it, right? But it's not like. When you're building a deck, you have to think about it all the time. Cards like that were Mega Minion, Bowler, Graveyard,
in their prime,
Night Witch, yes.
Where you had to make sure you had 2 Graveyard counters.
No, Graveyard was legitimately like that. It's like if I don't have Poison, I have to have like Archers and I don't know, like Knight, or Knight, It's like like because you look at a deck and then you're like, oh, you only have 1 Graveyard counter, you need another one, or that deck won't work.
Sad for you.
It's like you need anti-poison, anti-lightning.
Yeah, so like when a new card comes out, and if you just use those metrics, like you use those experiences of the past to see whether or not this card lives up to it. Mega Knight is not at that point where people are creating decks specifically to answer for it or to at least have multiple responses to it. And I don't think it'll actually ever get to that point, because the only way for Mega Knight to ever get to that point is if they buff it or they give it even something else, which I don't see happening right now. If anything, I see it getting a nerf, which makes it even that much more in a controlled place.
Which is nice, because I mean, it's not easy to balance a card, especially I think win conditions. And it's not really a win condition, but a lot of the times, well, we were talking about cards that like get worse as the time goes on. I think Mega Knight will be one of those, because if you release like a P.E.K.K.A. now, it's like that's not super like kind of tanks that are more defensive focused. I don't think those will, but usually it's win conditions that get better over time. Like Miner and Graveyard got better once people learned how to use them. And I don't think Mega Knight's like that. So I think if anything, it's going to be used a little bit less as time goes on. And it'll either stay in the same place or get a slight nerf. So that's nice. It brings like a new mechanic and a new type of gameplay, which is good. So.
Samsung on Twitter asks, what macro play, great word, what macro play should different archetypes adopt against one another?
Let me take that.
I think it depends a
I
little
think that's,
bit on
I know what I want to
exact
say,
cards
but
and
I'll let
exact
Esopa go
decks.
first.
So the macro play mostly revolves around how you think about where each archetype kind of has its strengths or weaknesses, like during the game. So if you're ever playing Beatdown versus Siege, right, you are favored in that matchup. So your strength is that your tank can always soak up the X-bow, the mortar, whatever, and then counterattack, right? That's macro play. When we talk about macro play, it's overall game plan. So just think about how your deck overall goes against the other archetype, and that applies through all of them. You know, it's I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything else to the question.
I think so. I think if you look at it from the perspective of the favored in that matchup of Beatdown, you probably want to stick to your regular game plan. It's more interesting to think about what about when you're the underdog in that sense. How do you play differently if you're the Siege player, or if you're Control against Siege? You know,
you have to find your strength.
Yeah,
in the scenario of playing for Siege, it becomes more about playing like as the rat in the cat scenario. You have to kind of bait out their tank and then go into the opposite lane, or they play their tank behind, then you go right away. It's the biggest advice I can give you is thinking about what you want to do in this matchup. If you're just playing the matchup as you would normally against any archetype, you will lose. And I think that's the point that you have to focus on right there.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of non-pro players fail, is they have a deck and they like playing it one way, when if you're a top player, you kind of recognize how to play certain decks in every single matchup based on the tech, the cards that you're against. It's about finding strength and weaknesses and abusing them to your benefit. Like, if you're playing Minor Control against Beatdown, you always want to pressure opposite lane when they play a tank at the back, or the same lane, depending on how much damage you've already previously done, and then just defend after that. It's about like managing elixir. Sometimes you can't pressure if you're really far down already. That's why in Beatdown, a lot of the times you sacrifice tower damage to gain elixir advantage, because you typically rely on that one push breaking through, so you need to get the elixir advantage and then just take the tower all at once. And in every meta, you play a deck different against the other meta decks within the current game, and it just really depends. And the more you play, the more you realize if you're playing some type of tank deck against P.E.K.K.A., you either have to bait it out or you have to find ways to counter even on offense. So yeah, I mean, there's just, if you watch pros play, you'll kind of learn how they play against different decks. I think the important thing is teaching yourself how to recognize weaknesses and strengths, like Esopa said, during a game, as opposed to just wanting to play. Like, you don't just go Miner and then Goblins at the start of every single game, like clockwork. You can't do the same thing every game. It's really dependent on what your opponent is doing. And then it's all about adaptability, which is why the same players rise up patch after patch, unless they're just really good at one thing. So, yeah.
I'm going to use the same example of Tortug Data, but he is known as, the Expo God, right? When I first watched him play in CRL, what immediately stood out to me was that every time he played the same archetype, but it never looked the same. And whenever he played Expo, it was legitimately scary. His timings, his overall macro plan was so spot on, and he did things that you just didn't even think about. That is the overall difference in like one person's approach to macro play and like his like crazy experience playing this archetype. Yeah, like I can say for sure that like his macro plan is like better than almost anyone's when he goes up against like counter matchups. I never think of him as out when he's playing counter matchups, but if I think about other pros in the same scenario, I think that they probably most likely lose.
And so if you're the favored deck in that matchup, you generally just want to play it safe, play to the regular old game plan, and not make the one mistake that will give them an opening to win.
Yeah, it depends on what you're playing. Like, Expo is actually a weird matchup for like control decks, especially in previous metas with it's still the same for Miner, but you actually play entirely different. You don't and so Miner typically will defend and then counter push or push in between your opponent's pushes with small pushes, just trying to get like minor poison chip damage, waiting until double elixir to go more aggressive. And against Expo, they actually don't really do that at all. They just play their tanks in front of the tower and then poison and log the thing to death, and then just rinse and repeat until the tower gets low enough to actually go aggressive, or just rinse and repeat until the game is over. Expo players typically switch lanes, but then they've already got enough damage to just finish it off with miners. So really, you just play like a knight, and then you poison, and if you don't have knight in hand, you miner on top of the Expo, and then you poison. So yeah, it's just a different way. And that makes a lot of sense now, but when these archetypes and these new cards are both, I mean, going way back when like Expo starts first being played, people don't know how to counter it. And now then Expo decks, even when they ran Inferno, Expo decks, everyone thought was a Lava Loon counter, but Lava Loon actually has a pretty good matchup because if they like start Lava Hound at the beginning of the game, the Expo player can immediately go opposite lane, which like you think is a really good play, but Lava Loon players figured out that you just don't do anything. You just all in the opposite lane. If they do Inferno Tower, they're not going to have enough elixir to clean up the pups and the balloon, so their tower is still lost. And then the Lava Hound player just plops something down on top of the Expo because it took the opposite tower. So I think it's interesting how new techniques develop as players recognize that you play different matchups, very different, even if your deck is the same.
Yeah, credit to Nim Sensei for being one of the first guys to actually really hard commit to going for 3 crowns as a legit strategy instead of just being like, oh, I need to defend against everything that's coming up against me.
Yeah, and it really favors beatdown decks, and he likes to run heavier stuff. He likes to run like freeze decks as well, just more like heavy decks that you just ignore. And Serge will do the same thing. I think really good players know when to prioritize elixir advantages or prioritize just their push over their opponents. And Lava Loon is really good at that because Lava Loon likes to push through after the first tower is dead and go for the King Tower. So I like how the game is developed. It's a lot more sophisticated than people think on first glance, but it's good because it can also get a casual audience because it does seem pretty simple to understand at first.
Star Wars on Twitter asks, how do you handle pressure? I'm gonna assume he means like the pressure of a big event, not necessarily like pressure on your towers or whatever in game. So how would you deal with that? Is there anything you do special when you're hopping into some really big event, live event?
I do, yeah. I've been to like four live events now, and won money in 3 of them. It'll make 5 if I make CCGS, I guess. But for me at King's Cup, I was like absolute nervous wreck. But once I got into the game, and this has always just been kind of a thing I'm good at. I think I perform better at live events than I do online because I am better at getting into the game than other people are. And I mean, everyone has to deal with some level of nervousness because everyone here is in some way like played a competitive match. They know what I mean because I'm used to live events now, but when I first started playing, my first RPO match with 50 viewers, I absolutely like hardcore choked. Like 50 people watching me on Twitch like scared the living crap out of me. So it's something I've gotten better at. But yeah, the way I do it is I blast one song that I really like in my ears before competitive matches. And then when I get into the match, I turn it off and I turn the game volume like really high, and I just focus on the game. So basically I focus on one thing, which is the song before, and I used to play tennis, so I like hop around and crap too. But basically I make my mind focus on one thing, which is the song. And then once I get into the match, I'm focused only on the game. And that requires a lot more thought because I'm thinking about the things that happen during the game, but it's really about just focusing on one thing, not worrying about crowds, not worrying about like a chat, not worrying about what other people think, and just making your mind focus on one thing to like its fullest capabilities. So yeah.
Do you mute emotes?
Do I mute emotes? It depends. It depends on the player. I will do that sometimes. Yes. Honestly though, I've gone back on competitive matches and realized that someone emoted me during the game, and I wasn't muted. I just literally didn't see it or didn't think of it because I was so focused on the troop interactions and how much elixir I had that I had no idea that my opponent emoted. But because it's literally like the farthest thing from my mind. I'm focused entirely on troop interactions, my elixir, and the things that we talk about with like strengths and weaknesses. Like as soon as the game starts, as soon as I see their first card, I'm thinking about what their deck could be, what I need to do to counter it. Like when I'm in a competitive game, my mind is in like entirely like hyper focused mode. Unlike if I'm playing like a ladder or a grand challenge in the meantime, where I've got like Twitter open at the same time and I'm looking back and forth and I'm like not really paying attention. It's just a different mindset and if you get yourself into it, you just play a lot better, as I've found, because I've tried playing semi-competitive matches like RPL and stuff while I'm not focused, and it just isn't the same. Just getting focused it's a different mindset.
I mean, it's been a while since I did really well in anything, but the only time that I do really well these days is when I have like a lot of time to practice right before something.
That helps too.
And yeah, if I've been playing for 2 hours before I even start to begin something competitively, I've sort of zoned out everything else, and I feel like I'm in the zone, so to speak. You know, I'm prepared for everything. I'm thinking a step ahead, and that kind of also like frees up enough mental space to think about the bigger things. Like you have to stop paying attention to the microtransactions all the time and start thinking, what's my macro game plan here? You know,
a lot of people over defend because they're scared to take any damage at all. You have to kind of notice or recognize what's good for you in terms of like elixir management, and it's something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of repetition. It's really good, but obviously, to be focused on a matchup, because I find that something, and I talk about this in a little bit of my CCGS video, like weird decks that you've never seen before throw me off a lot. And that's why players like Nim Sensei are really good, is because they create new weird crap every time they have a big tournament. Pro players are really good at repeatedly doing the same matchup, so that it's almost like clockwork how they counter with the deck that they prefer, counter like specific meta decks. Like they know exactly what they need to do to win, and if you throw them off, it really hurts focus, because if I see like a really known deck in a competitive match, it like clicks in my head instantly. It's like, I got this. As opposed to when I have no idea what their deck is, it really like throws a wrench in concentration, and it's a lot harder for me to adapt on the fly than it is in something I practiced previously. Like you said, if you practice something a lot, it becomes a lot easier for you to not make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. All right, last question from Twitter from actually our graphic designer, David. Should there be a 0 or 0.5 elixir card or cost? So for example, Bomber's not really good at 3 elixir. What if they reduced that to 2.5 and had other cards that were at like 0.5 increments? Would you be up for that? I know we talked briefly before recording about a 0 cost card, and I don't know if that's ever in the cards, so to speak. Sounds a little too scary. Yeah, I couldn't do a 0 cost card. I don't know how you would do anything 0 cost that wouldn't be, crazy overpowered. Unless it was literally just a cycle. I mean, even that would be too good. Right?
Yeah, I feel like that would be too good.
I'm ready to talk about these two. I like this question a lot.
It's a really cool question.
I think that for the sake of simplicity for the game, that there really ought not to be 0.5 cost cards. I think that gets just a little bit too nitty gritty, and I think that there's usually sufficient balance tools in the dev toolbox to make cards better or worse at the 0.5 elixir cost level. And I think that cards like Bomber are kind of intentionally underpowered, and there's a good logic for there being cards like Bomb Tower that just kind of suck, but that provide counters to certain strategies in the early game. Like if you're in Arena 5, you need to have a Bomb Tower against someone. If you are up against just like huts after huts after huts in the game, you need to be able to put Bomb Tower in your deck. I think that the 0 cost thing is also kind of an interesting element. I suggested before we started talking that you could have like a 1 skeleton as a 0 cost card. I don't think that it would have a big impact on the game. Necessarily, a 0 cost card shouldn't have a big impact on the game itself, but you should. I think it would be really cool if we had more mechanics that allowed you to take advantage of the way that deck building works. And so I like the concept of a 0 cost card, but I think that the versatility that it would offer is bad, and I think that it should be kind of like pigeonholed some way in its design so that it only really works with like cycle decks, like a Hog Rider deck that wants to go like 2.3, like something super insanely cheap.
Yeah.
And I do, however, think that there would be really cool ways to add different costs to the game. Like I think it'd be really cool if there were a card that damaged your own troops or damaged your own towers in some way. I think it'd be really cool if there were cards that like built up in strength over time so that they're bad when you initially play them, but like like the Elixir Monster is a card that they were like toying around with an idea of like something that like gains in power over time. I think that there's a lot of different mechanics and like cost elements that they could change to the game without necessarily introducing this like 0.5 cost idea.
In terms of the 0 elixir card or whatever, I prefer your idea of Dark Mirror over it, because Dark Mirror, at the very least, it does give decks more versatility, but it also has like a clear cutoff. It has a clear like payoff, right? And that the card that you choose is 1 elixir over. If you have a 0 elixir card, it's purely there to cycle, and there's almost every benefit for you to play a 7 card deck over an 8 card deck, because you'll always be able to. You're basically always cycling a lot faster than your opponent.
You just choose cards that like XE that you can cycle back to and have 2 of, as opposed to having multiple air counters. You just need 1 that you can get back to. Yeah.
Exactly. So this card would be indefinitely probably the most broken card in the game to ever come out.
What if it like was a reverse mirror where like if you play the 0 elixir card, the next card that you play is under leveled, or like if you play the 0 elixir card, you like take 100 damage on a random tower.
Like
the
tower activates. You're like, yeah.
I do like that, and Dark Mirror and other ways of working with like just working outside of this is a troop or this is a spell and it costs X amount. Designing more cards like Mirror, for instance, and your Dark Mirror idea, which I'm liking more and more, Woody. I think they could come up with some creative things like that as opposed to a 0 elixir card or 0.5.
Yeah. In terms of the 0.5 whatever 0.5 like metric meter cards, I don't think it should ever be implemented, because like this game was created and balanced at 10 elixir, like even elixir amounts. We've never been introduced to something that's been half or 2.5 or anything like that. And it's you don't know, like I can almost guarantee you that if it was put into the game, it will throw off everyone for the longest time, because something so simple has probably the more bigger impact than something that is really advanced and it gets put into the game. This is so simple that it could break the game, I think.
Here's an element. Sorry, I know I'm throwing a lot of ideas out, but I think that this one actually kind of does speak to what you're talking about to try to get to a half elixir point. If you play Hearthstone, you're familiar with the concept of overload, where you have a cost related to the card and then it imposes an additional cost later. I think it would be really cool if you had a card that had like a value equal to like 2.5 and it only costs 2 to play it. So you could like add it on to a quick attack, at the very last moment, but then it delays your elixir generation by 1 after you play it. So you only need 2 elixir to play it, but it costs 3 in total.
That's fine, because like it still stays at 2. There's no hidden value, the 2.5 value, whatever that is like hidden. It's not there. It's not flat. This costs 2.5 to play. If it costs 2.5 to play, I think that's the problem. If it costs 2, but its value is 3, fine. The Night Witch was 4, but its real true value was around like 5.5 or 6. But that never was the case. It never was just like 5.5 or anything like that.
Interesting. I think
it's another thing I think they should look at is other cards like Elixir Collector that manipulate, I don't want to say like manipulate the rules of the game, but manipulate the way that the game is played and how it's, a steady stream of elixir. I don't know. I've thought about it a lot, but I'm not a game designer. I can't think of many good ideas along those lines.
They're super cool, but they're some of the most dangerous cards to introduce to the game.
True.
For sure.
Cards that affect like the fundamental, just like the base are really tricky and probably better to not mess with. It's probably better to just keep on creating interesting cards. That's the easier way to do it.
Yeah.
I wonder if at some point they're going to shake things up a little bit, like in Clash of Clans, Elixir and Dark Elixir are like totally separate things that do separate things, create separate troops and whatever. I wonder if they're kind of saving that for potential future, not even like update, but like revamp of the game where they introduce a whole new concept like Dark Elixir that kind of affects the fundamentals of the game.
Like a new game.
You know?
Hero units.
Yeah. Hero units. I
wonder
if hero units would be like you know how you obviously have 8 cards. I wonder if that would be like any time you have your 4 cards, but then you had like a 5th unit that has like 1 or 2 uses, like limited uses during the game that you can use at any time.
Like a side card.
Yeah, like a summoner spell.
Be kind of
like a summoner spell in League of Legends. Like just something that you have like limited uses on, or it has a cooldown. That would be interesting. But of course, if it's too good, you just play it every time you can.
I thought you were suggesting like if you had 3 or 4 cards and you managed to get them all down at the same time, they would come together and form.
No, that's stupid. I meant
crazy fusion.
I meant like you just have like you have a side card that you have to think about during the game as well. Just adding, I don't know, more complexity, but also if it was too good, I don't know, that'd have to take a lot of play testing.
Colton, let me know what you think about this. It's a really powerful card, right? So when you play it, the card like stays in your slot, your like row there, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't facilitate deck cycle. That would be obviously bad. It would be like an additional cost for the card, but it would be something like for the like Barbarian King or Archer Queen in Clash of Clans. You like keep that button and it remains activated, and then like when you push it, it does another thing. Okay. Would you like a card that like keeps its spot in the slot and like hurts your deck cycle, but is like more powerful?
Oh, so like when you play this card, it's stronger. It's a strong card because it takes up one of your slots. So when you play it, you're not cycling to another card. Yeah, that would be interesting. That could be another way they would implement heroes. And then until that troop dies, you don't get that slot back.
Right.
So that would be weird how that would affect meta, because it would make it basically to where you want decks that are probably really cheap, I would think. But I don't know. That could also be big in a big beatdown to push. I don't know. It's one of those things that you'd have to play it to understand. But yeah, that's weird, because you would lose the ability to cycle quickly, so you could be punished opposite side if you're trying to get back to like something in specific. Yeah, that's interesting.
Woody should be on the creation.
Yeah, and then he makes something that's broken and we all hate him.
It's
Why
okay
did we
because then
get
you
Woody
could
into that
also
job?
balance
Yeah,
it.
you can also balance it.
That's-
Everyone
That's
balances.
true.
So I'm pretty sure Woody of all people would know what a broken card would look like.
Hmm. Maybe.
Well, that's everything we got from Twitter, and we've been going for an hour and a half. So,
True.
you guys want to wrap it up?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, thank you guys for coming on. And if there's anyone you want to shout out or anything at all, feel free to do so.
Thank you guys for having me on. I haven't been streaming lately. I've been actually focused way more on both school and everything else, right? And also a lot of League of Legends.
That'll happen. when we play
I
League
will
of Legends.
unashamedly say that like I'm obsessed with that game at the moment. But yeah, thank you guys for having me on, and it's always a pleasure to come on and talk Clash.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, guys. I'm Woody. I'm the leader of Reddit Alpha, and I've got a Twitch and a YouTube channel. I also am over on the Twitterverse. Woody_CR is my Twitter account if you want to give me a follow, and stay tuned.
Follow both these guys on YouTube and Twitch because they are two of the best tacticians and strategists and thinkers about the game that we've had in the short history of this game. So thanks again, guys, for joining us this time.
Yep. See you guys next week. Peace.